The last flight of Rakia. Far beyond the familiar stars of Earth's night sky, in the endless black expanse of the Andromeda Galaxy, a sleek silver spacecraft hurtled through the void, its engines howling as they strained against the weight of its desperate flight. Inside the cockpit, the young Arcturian woman, Rakia, sat tense, her fingers gripping the controls so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her blue skin, illuminated by the soft glow of her ship's instrumentation, seemed to shimmer in the low light of the spacecraft's cabin. Her golden eyes flickered nervously over the radar screen, where dots representing the enemy's pursuit steadily grew larger. Rakia's heart hammered in her chest, each pulse a reminder of the danger she was in. The calm and peaceful existence she had known just a short while ago felt like a lifetime ago. Arua Prime, her homeworld, had been a place of balance and serenity, nestled in the heart of the Arcturian star system. The Arcturians were a people of great intelligence, known for their peaceful coexistence with the other species in their sector. Rakia, the daughter of a prominent political activist, had been raised with ideals of fairness, justice, and the belief that no regime should dominate the will of the people. But that world had shattered when Emperor Kang Gran took power in a brutal coup, tearing through the political landscape like a storm. The emperor's rise to power was marked by tyranny, ruthless control, and the imposition of laws that stripped the Arcturians of their autonomy. The once vibrant political atmosphere on Arua Prime was replaced by fear and silence. Opponents of the emperor, those who spoke out against his oppressive rule, were silenced, their voices stifled by imprisonment and violence. Rakia's family, long advocates for freedom and justice, were among the first to be targeted. Her father, a well-respected leader in the Arcturian Council, had been one of the loudest voices against Kang Gran's authoritarian rise. His political activism made him an immediate target. One night, Rakia had awoken to the sound of pounding footsteps outside her home, the door crashing open as the emperor's soldiers stormed in. They took her parents, shackled and bloodied, leaving Rakia alone in the night, unsure of their fate. The days that followed were filled with a sinking dread, as Rakia learned of the fate of countless others who had dared to challenge Kang Gran's regime. Her parents, along with dozens of political activists, were taken to a secret facility, where rumors of torture and execution spread like wildfire. Rakia knew, deep down, that her time was limited. If she stayed on Arua Prime, she would share the same fate as those who had resisted. In the quiet of the night, she made a decision that would change everything. The loss of her family, her home, and her world was too much to bear, but there was a greater truth that hung heavy in her heart. She could not sit idly by and wait for the Emperor's forces to come for her too. With trembling hands, Rakia stole away in the dead of night, leaving behind all that she knew, all that she loved, and took refuge in the one thing she could still control: her escape. Using a small, unarmed scout ship that had been left behind by a long-forgotten expedition, Rakia launched herself into the unknown reaches of space. Her ship, a tiny, barely functional vessel, was no match for the advanced warships that Kang Gran commanded. It was fast, yes, but fragile, vulnerable to the crushing firepower of the Emperor's fleet. Her only hope lay in the vastness of space and the chance that she could escape undetected long enough to find a place to hide. As the ship tore through the darkness, Rakia set her course for a distant star system, far beyond the reach of Arua Prime's atmosphere. She knew it was a gamble, one she could not afford to lose, but the alternative was certain death. She scanned the star charts, eyes darting over the unfamiliar names of distant solar systems. She had no idea where to go, only that she had to keep moving, keep searching for a place where she could disappear. Then her eyes caught something. A small, unremarkable star system nestled at the edge of the galaxy. It was labeled Sol, and its third planet was marked simply as Earth. According to the scant information available in the ancient databases, Earth was home to a young species of intelligent beings known as humans, who were still technologically primitive. Rakia's heart pounded in her chest as she considered her options. She had no way of knowing if the humans were hostile, or if they even had the means to defend themselves against the Emperor's fleet. But there was no time left. Her pursuers were closing in fast, their ships now visible on the radar. With no other viable options, Rakia made a split-second decision. She keyed in the coordinates for Earth and engaged the ship's warp drive. The tiny vessel lurched forward, the universe stretching and warping around her as the ship hurtled through the blue vortex of a wormhole. Rakia closed her eyes, the roar of the engines vibrating through her bones, and whispered a silent prayer to the gods of her people. She had no idea what awaited her on this distant world, but she knew one thing. Anything had to be better than the certain death that awaited her at the hands of Emperor Kangran. The wormhole spit her out into the unknown reaches of space, and Rakia watched in awe as the stars danced around her. A never-ending sea of light and wonder. Her ship, though battered and worn, was alive. And so was she. But as the ship descended toward Earth, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey had only just begun, and that the future, though uncertain, held a promise of something greater than she had ever imagined. Meanwhile, back on Earth, a man named Miles Jensen was about to have his life changed forever. A crash of fate. Miles Jensen was just a regular guy, nothing extraordinary. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a small Arizona town. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange, pink, and purple. Miles sat on his porch, a cold beer in hand, letting the warm breeze of the desert wash over him. It was the kind of evening that made him appreciate the simplicity of his life. There were no wars, no great crises, just the quiet hum of the evening cicadas and the occasional caw of a crow in the distance. But that peace was shattered in an instant. One moment, Miles was watching the sunset, thinking about the small details of life that brought him comfort, a good meal, a quiet evening, the steady rhythm of his daily routine. The next, a blinding flash of light filled the horizon, brighter than any lightning bolt he had ever seen. The ground shook beneath his feet, sending a jolt through his body as if the very earth had cracked open. Miles instinctively dropped his beer, which splashed across the ground as he leaped to his feet, his heart racing. Was that a meteor? He muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the desert around him. The flash had been so intense, so close, that he had no idea where it had come from. But when he looked up, all he could see was an enormous column of smoke rising into the air, a trail of fire streaking across the sky, as if the very stars themselves had fallen to earth. Without thinking, Miles grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the source of the disturbance. His feet kicked up dust as he ran through the dry terrain, the sound of his breath heavy in his ears. As he approached the site, he slowed down, his steps cautious. The area was eerily quiet, no other sound to be heard but the distant howl of the wind. The desert stretched before him, barren and silent, save for the massive plume of smoke that billowed from the impact site. Miles crept closer, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He had no idea what to expect. Maybe it was just some kind of military test, or perhaps some kind of research experiment gone wrong. But what he saw when he arrived at the crash site was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. Lying amidst the twisted metal and burning wreckage was a ship. No, a spacecraft. Its design was sleek, its silver surface shimmering against the backdrop of the desert. The ship was unlike anything Miles had ever seen. It wasn't the typical design of an Earth-made craft. There were no markings, no insignia, just a smooth, almost organic shape that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the figure lying beside the ship. A woman. Her body was sprawled out on the ground, partially hidden by the wreckage. Miles rushed to her side, his heart pounding as he knelt down beside her. Her skin was unlike anything he had ever seen before, an otherworldly shade of deep blue, and her features were delicate and angular, almost ethereal. Her long white hair, streaked with hints of silver, fell in a tangled mess around her face. Her eyes, when he looked into them, were golden, shimmering like molten metal in the dim light. At first, Miles thought she might be dead. Her body lay still, the faint rise and fall of her chest barely noticeable. But as he gently touched her arm, she stirred. Her hand twitched, and then she slowly opened her eyes, locking her gaze with his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with an unspoken understanding that neither could explain. The woman's golden eyes flickered with recognition as she saw Miles, and though her lips moved, no sound came out. It was as if her very presence in that moment defied the laws of nature itself. Her voice, when it came, was a soft, melodic whisper, though Miles could barely make out the words. "Help me," she said, her voice like a distant melody, strained and hoarse. Miles, still in shock, nodded instinctively. He had no idea what had just happened, who this woman was, or how she had ended up in the middle of the desert, but something in her voice called to him. It was as if she was in desperate need of help, and the urgency in her eyes was undeniable. Without thinking, he scooped her up into his arms, careful not to disturb her too much. She was incredibly light, almost fragile, but the warmth of her body was undeniable, even through the strange, almost cold quality of her skin. He glanced around, realizing just how isolated they were. There was no one for Miles. No roads, no people, just the vast expanse of the desert. "Hang on," Miles muttered as he began to carry her back to his house, his feet stumbling over rocks and uneven terrain. As he walked, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Was she even human? And most importantly, why had she crashed on Earth, of all places? By the time he reached his house, the desert night had fully descended, and the temperature had dropped significantly. He rushed inside and laid the woman down on his couch, covering her with a blanket. The woman's eyes fluttered closed again, and for a moment, Miles thought she might fall back into unconsciousness. But instead, her lips parted, and her voice, faint but stronger than before, whispered again. "Emperor Kangran, he follows me." Miles' mind was in turmoil. The name she had spoken, Emperor Kangran, didn't sound like anything from Earth. Her words held a deep fear, a terror that made his blood run cold. Who was this emperor, and why was she fleeing from him? For the first time since the crash, Miles allowed himself to breathe, realizing that his life had just been turned upside down. He had always been a man of simple pleasures, a man who had never considered himself a part of anything greater than his quiet life. But now, with an alien woman on his couch speaking of dark forces chasing her across the stars, Miles knew that the simple life he had once cherished was over. He had no idea where this story would lead, but he couldn't ignore the pull of something far greater than himself. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. And what was coming next was beyond anything he could have ever imagined. A distant pursuit. The next morning, Miles awoke to the quiet hum of his air conditioning, the faint sound of wind rustling outside his window. For a moment, everything seemed normal, as if the events of the previous night had been a strange, vivid dream. But as his eyes opened, the reality of the situation came crashing down on him. His mind still reeled from the sight of the mysterious woman with blue skin and golden eyes, the woman who had crashed into his backyard, fleeing from something he could not yet comprehend. The woman. She was still in his living room, lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her skin glowed faintly in the morning light, casting a soft shimmer across the room. She seemed peaceful, almost fragile, as she lay there. Miles stood still for a moment, studying her, wondering if this was all just some kind of elaborate prank, or if he had somehow fallen into some sci-fi nightmare. The oddity of the situation was enough to make him question his sanity. A strange woman from space, a spaceship crash, and talk of an emperor named Kang Gran. It all felt too surreal. But the woman, Rakia, she had told him her name, was real, and her presence was undeniable. Her story, though fragmented, had started to make a chilling kind of sense. Rakia had spoken of fleeing a brutal regime, one that had ripped her life apart and sent her running across the stars. She was not just any alien. She was a refugee, a political exile escaping the crushing tyranny of an emperor who ruled with an iron fist. As Miles sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, his mind kept returning to her words. Emperor Kang Gran. He follows me. Those words echoed in his mind, tinged with fear and desperation. Who was this emperor? What kind of power did he wield to make Rakia flee her home planet? And why Earth? Rakia had refused to say much more, her voice weak and her memory scattered as she fought through the shock of her crash landing. She had seemed disoriented, her body exhausted from the long journey. But now, as she slept in his living room, her presence felt heavier, like the weight of an entire galaxy pressing down on his small, quiet world. The peaceful morning was short-lived. Miles had barely finished his coffee when he heard a sharp mechanical noise from outside. The unmistakable sound of engines, powerful engines, cut through the stillness of the desert air. Miles shot to his feet, heart racing. He rushed to the window, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the sky filled with the unmistakable silhouette of multiple spacecrafts, each one sleek and menacing, cutting through the atmosphere toward his location. It was happening. Rakia's pursuers were here. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The peaceful life he had known, his quiet existence in the desert, was no more. He was in this now, dragged into a story far beyond anything he could have imagined. These ships weren't from Earth. Their design was unlike anything from any military in the world. Their sleek metallic surfaces glinted under the morning sun, and their engines hummed with a deadly power. They were hunters, and Rakia was their prey. Without thinking, Miles turned and sprinted toward the living room, his heart pounding in his chest. Rakia was still lying on the couch, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. But Miles could see the signs, the tension in her body, the faint shimmer of blue energy that seemed to pulse from her skin. She had to know. She must have felt it. Rakia, he said, his voice urgent but gentle as he knelt by her side. She stirred at the sound of his voice, her golden eyes fluttering open. The panic was clear in her gaze as she tried to sit up, her body trembling from the weight of what was happening. "They're here, aren't they?" Miles asked, his throat dry. Rakia nodded, her expression filled with dread. She slowly rose to her feet, her movements unsteady, as if her body was still trying to recover from the crash. "They found me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never thought they'd reach Earth. I thought I had more time." "More time for what?" Miles asked, his brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of her words. "Who are they?" "Emperor Kang Gran's forces," Rakia replied, her voice sharp with fear. "They are relentless. His empire has been hunting me for weeks now, ever since I escaped Arua Prime. His soldiers, his agents, are everywhere. They don't stop, and they never forget." Miles felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He wasn't just dealing with an alien on his couch. He was in the middle of something far more dangerous, something that threatened the very existence of his quiet life, his home, and even his planet. He wasn't sure how far Kang Gran's reach extended, but if what Rakia said was true, then Earth had just become a target. Rakia moved toward the window, her gaze focused on the sky as the ships drew closer. She pressed her hand to her chest, as if trying to steady her racing heart. "I can't let them find me," she murmured. "I can't let them destroy Earth. They will do it without hesitation. They will burn this world to the ground just to get to me." "What do we do?" Miles asked, his voice hoarse with panic. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to land. We need a plan." Rakia turned toward him, her face grim. "You need to get me off this planet. You need to get me somewhere they can't find me. But first, I have to show you something. I can't keep running forever." Before Miles could ask what she meant, Rakia turned and walked toward the back of the house, her movements deliberate, purposeful. She stepped into a small room that Miles had never paid much attention to, an old storage closet that he used to keep his tools. But as Rakia pushed open the door, he was stunned by what he saw. Hidden in the shadows of the room was a strange device, sleek, metallic, and glowing faintly with blue light. It looked like nothing Miles had ever seen before, not even in the science fiction books he had read. Rakia moved to the device and placed her hand on it, and the blue light seemed to pulse in response. "This is my last hope," Rakia said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "It's a distress beacon, a way to call for help. If I can activate it, someone from my world will come for me. But it won't be easy. The moment this thing activates, Kang Gran will know where I am, and I'll have to fight until they arrive." Miles looked at the device, then back at Rakia. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of her journey, and the realization that her fight was far from over. But in that moment, he knew something deep in his gut, something that wasn't just fear. He had to help her. He couldn't turn his back now. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it." Rakia's eyes softened, just for a moment, and for the first time since their meeting, she offered him a small, fragile smile. "Thank you, Miles. You don't know what this means." With the ships closing in fast and time running out, they had no choice but to face the storm together. Earth, once a peaceful haven, was now a battleground. And Rakia's last hope for survival, and perhaps the survival of Earth itself, rested in their hands.